Okay, let's get started with two announcements. Homework 3 is due tonight. If you haven't already done that, I saw a lot of people turning it in, so that's good. Um, and also due tonight is the Project Team Dynamics Survey, which does not count for any points or anything, but is really helpful to help me, determine your grade on your project and determine if you need any help with your project or anything like that. So I encourage you to please fill it out if you can. You will be required to do one for the end of your project. This one is optional.
Do you remember where the group evaluation thing is at? Because I saw it earlier
Okay.
and I couldn't find it.
Is it hard to find? I was wondering if it was pushing it out or not because it's okay. Yeah, it's in quizzes, and it's weird because it's technically a ungraded survey or something when I set it up, and I don't think it notifies the same way because of that. But yeah, it's just under quizzes. Okay, so this is our semester plan. Hasn't changed any since last time. We're going to do social HCI today, and then we'll do next week. We'll do robots, AI, machine learning, AR, VR, and then we will do failed HCI, ethical concerns with HCI, persuasive computing, kind of all of the things that everyone submitted for quiz 6 as areas they were interested in. And then everything else is the same in terms of the exam and the final project. So also, homework 4 is up, and it will be due next week, a week from today. And it is our last homework, so that is the sad faces for. So for this one, what we're going to do is basically, if you look at any kind of TV show or movie, a lot of plots necessitate that the characters interact with some type of interface, some type of computer or some type of machine, and sometimes it's essential to the plot, or it's the TV show or the movie is focused around technology and interface kind of things. But sometimes it's just incidental. They have to use an app to do something. What's really interesting is that for the most part, the TV show creators or the movie creators will develop their own kind of custom interfaces for everything they do. A lot of that's to avoid copyright and dating things and dealing with that. But this is kind of interesting for us because if you just hit pause whenever these interfaces are showing on your screen, you can see some really interesting things sometimes. And so some shows or movies actually focus on making their interfaces in a really thorough way. They have teams dedicated to prototyping these things and making these apps basically that they're not real necessarily, but that makes sense. And some of them don't. So if it's just going to be a quick cutscene or something and you're just going to see it fly by, they may not put a lot of effort into it. So for this assignment, what I'd like you to do is to find at least 2 interfaces, and it could be software, it could be hardware, and then for each of them, get basically a screenshot of the interface, and tell me where it's from and what time I can find it in the movie or the episode. And then kind of just annotate it with a description of the UI, maybe write like this is what it was being used for plot-wise, and then here's all of this stuff on here, and what is kind of write a little commentary about what's there and if it makes sense, if it doesn't make sense, if there's something interesting or not, and then turn that in. So you'll find a lot of interesting things, and in some ways. Some movies have really motivated the interfaces that we've developed later for actual products. It's definitely the case. And Hollywood seems to really get into kind of the strangest and the newest kind of technology. So you'll see lots of gesture interfaces and augmented reality kinds of things happening. So you can look at stuff like that as well. But also just regular apps or interfaces are useful. I've included some links here. They're referenced up above. So the first one is actually an interview with the guy who does the UI design for Westworld. And so it's a really interesting article.
Westworld.
So yeah, if you haven't watched Westworld, you should check that out. But so that was really interesting. The second one is a video of CSI technology, which is always great. And then the third one is also it's just a compilation of zoom and enhance interfaces and kind of the things that we see portrayed there. So I hope this will not be too taxing of an assignment, and I hope that you get some really interesting results here. Okay. So last time we talked about visualizing data. We talked about analyzing data in different ways. So we focused on the kind of data that we would have, some quantitative data basically. We talked about for our interfaces things like success rates, level of success, how long it takes somebody to do something, and then qualitative measures like asking someone about their experience with an interface. We briefly touched on some stats, and we said that mostly we'll focus on descriptions or descriptives in terms of our user evaluation. So just kind of giving measures of central tendency, like the average time to do something, the percent of users who were able to do something, things like that. And then we mentioned that for more user studies that are more rigorous and like academic kind of studies, that we really have to care a lot about comparing groups and the right statistical tests to make sure that everything is how it needs to be. And then we mentioned visualizations. And specifically, I told you should look at the Data is Beautiful subreddit just to see some different visuals with some interesting data. And then also, if you're really seriously into this and find this kind of thing interesting, all of Edward Tuff's books are pretty much the gold standard, the authoritative work on this kind of thing. All right, so today we're going to change gears a little bit, and I want to talk about social HCI some, and I thought this was a great way to introduce this. This popped up like a day or two ago on my phone, and I just couldn't resist using this to open this section. So Facebook's promising that they're going to stop asking us to wish happy birthday to our friends who have died. Are you sad about them stopping that, or okay? So here's the problem, right? People have Facebook accounts, and people die, and their Facebook accounts are there. Facebook has an option where you can, memorialize an account, right? So whoever, friends or family, there are channels for them to communicate with Facebook and to get the account marked basically as a person who's no longer alive. And once that's done, obviously Facebook treats that account differently. It doesn't expect that account to be active. It doesn't, ask people to wish that account a happy birthday. The problem is that it's not always possible, or people don't always think about telling Facebook that someone has passed away. And so Facebook may not know that. And then in that case, it's going to treat that like it's any other user, and it's going to try to get you to engage with them. So I didn't include the article here, but basically Facebook made some vague statements that they would use some AI and some machine learning to try to determine if a person had passed away or not, and even if the account had not been marked. And we see this kind of thing has been troublesome for Facebook, particularly, sometimes they'll give you like, on this day so many years ago, or here's some random memories or whatever. And sometimes there are things that people don't want to remember. So this is kind of troubling, and it's something to think about. And so today, kind of preparing for what we're going to do next week, which is talk a lot about some of the more modern, I guess, issues that have to do with HCI and user experiences. And we'll talk about AI and machine learning and how that all contributes to it as well. We'll just talk about a few social things. We've covered some of this when we did our Valentine's Day Love lecture, so I'll try not to repeat anything too much, but to start with, I'll just give you the reminder here. So humans are social, and we talked a lot about early in the semester, like cognitive psychology and sensation perception and that side of humans and how that influences what we build and the systems that we make. But there's also social psychology, social side to humans. And that also has a huge effect on the technology that we build. So I picked a few areas just to mention. And we'll talk about how technology or how the interfaces and machines we build interact with these areas. So just the first basic one that we'll spend quite a bit of time on is just social interactions in general. And then we'll talk about physical and psychological well-being, considerations for vulnerable groups, thinking about equality and fairness and what that means in terms of technology, and then things like government and politics and how we factor in there. So thinking just about social interactions, we'll start with face-to-face conversations. So this is just going to show you two people having a conversation. And it seems pretty simple when you think about it. But there's actually a lot that goes on just in a simple conversation. So in this case, it's just agreeing. So you've got these two people. First of all, they're physically in the same environment. They maintain some distance between each other. That's usually dictated by how well they know each other and the culture that they're in. And there's also some moderators. So in some cases, like these people are presumably two different genders. That may have an effect as well on how close they're going to stand together. But then the other thing that you have with humans that's pretty big is the fact that we typically make eye contact throughout conversations and when we talk. And we don't just stare for the whole time. We actually avert, fixate, and do a lot of behavior there. Our faces are expressive even when we don't consciously, try to make an expression. They communicate. They give information back to the person we're talking to. Gestures, postures, all of these things are pretty important. And so for like the research that I do, which is social robots interacting with people, all of these things start to add up quite a bit. When you think about trying to create something that's going to consider these things and then actually be able to do these things on a level that doesn't break this interaction. So we also have basic conversational rules that we follow. And so in this case, here's three people talking. Turn taking is a big aspect of social communication for humans. For the most part, we're pretty good at taking turns. Sometimes, we're not. Sometimes certain people aren't. Or if we're talking about something that really excites us, we might not be. But in general, humans tend to take turns, and they do it very fluidly. And so if you're building something that is going to have a natural language conversation with a human, this is actually really difficult to do in terms of like not cutting someone's speech off, especially if you're a system that's relying on speech recognition to tell you when someone's talking and trying to figure out if they're done talking, if they're just pausing to think. These are all very nuanced little things that we don't really have to think about much. It just works for us. So basically, here are some rules from like some really old work, probably out of psychology, but basically saying that we have kind of this recipe or this algorithm to tell us how to have a conversation with someone. And this is the turn-taking rule kind of thing. And so one other thing that we should think about in terms of turn taking is that a lot of times we might be speaking, but if I am expecting someone to answer, I might look at the person that I'm expecting to answer if there are multiple people. So the cues are not always in one modality. So we'll kind of use whatever is available to us. And certainly even depending on context, we may use a different cue. So if our hands are constrained doing something, we may just use like the turn of the head or something. If we're closer to someone, we're probably going to move our eyes before we actually shift our whole head, that kind of thing, which is actually like a whole thing you have to think about if you have a robot that has eyes and a head, and like when should it just move the eyes and when should the head move, and, and it not actually be horrible. Some other kind of just conversational rules that we have, things like, we usually have kind of a farewell ritual. We'll say bye or see you later, or somehow indicate that we're done talking. And we can pick up on cues that tell us someone doesn't want to continue a conversation or they need to be somewhere, that kind of thing. So we also ask for clarification when we need it. And we also use a lot of filler words. So like I'm saying when in between things here. That's something that stands out for humans. And it can be a little bit difficult in terms of like parsing natural language and trying to see which ones are meaningful and which ones are not. Now I'm going to be thinking about my filler words the whole time I'm talking to you guys. Okay. So, thinking a little bit about how technology plays into something like a conversation. Thinking specifically, we'll talk about social media conversations first. And the question being, do these same rules apply when we look at these different modalities of speaking? So obviously the telephone's been around for a long time. Rules are slightly different on the phone because you don't have any of the visual cues. You're relying a lot on voice. But voice is actually pretty powerful because there are a lot of things in your voice, basically like the prosody of your voice, the tone, the pacing, anything that you're doing like that kind of gives a hint or a clue to the person you're talking to about your state. Certainly this changes when we look at things like email or instant messaging when we're in a text form now. So a lot of cues can be lost there, and a lot of other cues can be added when we look at something like emojis or even just the ability to put GIFs or pictures or things to supplement our communication. And then we have kind of the video chat aspect of Skyping. So this all falls under remote conversations. And this is really one of the first places that we see technology and kind of HCI coming into play in terms of shaping social interactions. And in this case, it's more of, we started with bringing technology in to be a tool to augment our social communications. And so what we see is that in general, we try to mimic the in-person, face-to-face conversation with our technologies. So some of the earliest examples are these different concepts for video phones and video chatting. So very early on, we thought that this would be great to add this visual channel to remote communication. And I have a video. And I think this is one of the first video phones. Yeah, okay, so I'll play this.
First demonstration of the telephone of tomorrow at the Western Electronics Convention in San Francisco. It's the often forecast video phone. How does it work? Just lift the receiver and you see your own image. This feature's for the girls. At long last, a reason for the primping that usually precedes a woman's phone call. No picture is transmitted over the line, though, since no call is placed. Then dial your number just as with an obsolete old 55 model phone, and when your party answers, there he is, almost as big as life on the 10-inch video screen. The system could have its disadvantages as well as virtues, but there's plenty of time to iron out problems in human relations. This hookup would cost $5,000 per phone today. So until the price comes down, the video phone remains the phone of the future. See you then. Good looking.
Old America. Okay. So even though it was, weaved within a bunch of sexist comments, we can see that even in this early prototype, they're mentioning some of the differences between being able to have a conversation with a video feed and just having an audio conversation. So this has been something that we've been interested in for a while. So now we have things like Skype. We also have things probably more relevant to like that video would be like Amazon, their various voice assistant devices that go in the home. The ones with the screens on them now have features where you can drop in and do a video call with people. And this is a nice thing to have because it does facilitate some things. And it basically restores a lot of the visual channels that we lose when we just have audio. When we look at things that are not so much using the traditional way of talking, using your voice, and looking at another person, we can move to things like Facebook and Twitter or just text modalities. Some of the things that are interesting beyond just the realm of communication person to person or group to group is when we start to look at something like the use of Twitter in like a disaster or an emergency. And so we start to see that this is something that can be very useful, but also something that we kind of have to approach with caution at times in terms of like, say we have an emergency situation. There have been several instances where people are able to tweet out their location and that they need help, or able to tweet a picture of what they're seeing that can then be used by people who are responding to a disaster to help inform them about what's going on somewhere. But we also see people abusing this or kind of spoofing this information to cause problems in some cases. And so this has been a problem for as long as these things have existed. More recently, we hear lots of concern about fake news and things like that on social media. And so that's also something that we do have to worry about. And so ultimately, kind of the good that we have here where we're getting more information can be outweighed sometimes by the confusion that can be caused. And so these are things to think about. Pushing forward a little bit in terms of remote communications, and this will be more person-to-person, telepresence. So this is the idea that maybe just being on a screen is not enough because you do lose some embodiment, some sense of being there. And we've talked a little bit about different systems that allow telepresence. But the idea is that we want the person to feel more present and like the other people are with them, wherever they are. And so we'll look at a couple of examples of that. So this is a research example. Hypermirror, basically it puts you, kind of uses a keying technique to make you see a monitor with yourself with people remotely, but you're all on the same screen together. So it's compositing the different video feeds in to give you a sense of being physically in the same space, which is kind of interesting. And so you can see kind of the two different feeds here, but it's still, that person is virtual, so you can't actually physically interact with them. This is maybe this is a video of it.
Okay, kali actually community dad. You can see from there also. I will find his face. Papa will find his face, okay? I just take your head, Papa. Papa will hit you go flying, okay?
Go stand. Go stand.
Okay. Hi.
So some of the kind of the scaling issues, and obviously just the desire to So yeah, these people had quite a fun time there. But so one thing that kind of stands out there is that the humans are adaptable, obviously, and so kind of just use the technology in a way that's fun and enjoyable to them. But the idea of those systems is basically, you have to look at the display to get the idea that you're together. So now we're starting to see some things, and we'll talk about specifically VR and how we've started doing things with that. We'll talk about that next week to kind of augment that. Now, robots have also been a huge part of trying to do this telepresence thing. This is a very early example, and you can see this is quite a large robot, but we've got like screens all the way around, right? And it can physically move around. So at least in the robotics community and in the HCI community, I guess to some degree, physical embodiment of a machine sets it apart from a virtual interface or avatar or something that is on a screen that you go to versus something that's in an environment that can perceive the environment and especially that can move through the environment or manipulate the environment. That's what sets apart, that's what the traditional definition of setting apart a robot versus just a computer or a machine is that the robot is physically in a world that it can act on, it can perceive it and can act on it. So looking at, this is the setup. If you want to be in the robot, you get kind of in this little tube thing here. So you kind of are looking around like you're actually in the robot. And then here's kind of a complicated, diagram of that. It's quite interesting. Today we see things like this, which are iPads on a stick. And it's basically got a little wheeled base, and it's an iPad, and it's got somebody's video feed on there. And they're usually horrible to try to control remotely. And yeah, but it kind of works. So that's somewhat interesting. Telepresence, we talked about this at one point, and I don't know if I had this picture to show you. But basically, this is kind of the solution that's been used in the business world for quite a while. The idea being you kind of have these conference rooms that can be identical on both in two locations, and you just set up these screens to mirror the other half of the room, but it's the other side. And this tends to be pretty useful because everybody's sitting at the same table, and given a low latency video feed, this can feel like you're in a meeting and can work pretty well. So one of the big questions when we start to do this, and we should say all of this is using technology to try to facilitate human-to-human communication. We're not communicating with the technology so much, we're going through it. We're using it as a medium. In some cases, when we start to look at telepresence, we have to consider things like, should the robot automatically do some things in terms of like navigating its environment and avoiding obstacles or slowing down, things that the human on the other side may not be able to do so well. So that's something to take into consideration. And so what do we need to make it more compelling? And that's actually a pretty difficult question. So we also have to think about coordination mechanisms. So when you have more than one human, you have more than just a one-on-one interaction, that becomes a concern. So people interacting with a large group and how that plays out, that scales up quite a bit. All right. So thinking back to social media, it's incredibly popular, but here are some questions that kind of can help you look at the broader social aspects of it. The first one kind of being the number of connections you have on a platform, a social media platform, versus the number of connections you have kind of in your actual day-to-day life out in the world. And then kind of the differences between those connections, and is there overlap in those connections, and how does that play out? So there's a lot of research in all of these questions, but in that area specifically, looking at what's different about this way of facilitating social interaction and social connections. And then also there's a lot of work looking at things like kind of just the rules and the etiquette that's part of online and offline interactions. So that's something that's been around for a while. There's quite a bit of research and quite a bit of convergence. We've also started to ask questions, obviously, like, is using social media good for us? Is it healthy? Does it have psychological benefits? Does it have drawbacks? We've started to converge on the idea that a lot of it does have drawbacks. Obviously, that's like an average, right? When we do research like that, we're saying on average, and we have to be careful about that. But that's something that we're concerned about, and that's something that's kind of ongoing. But what's more interesting, maybe, is not so much talking about technology that just facilitates social interaction. We will talk about specifically persuasive computing, and kind of this does fall over into social media. So how does someone like Facebook keep the user engaged and keep them on the site longer? How do you keep a child playing a game for 4 hours straight? How do you get those in-app purchases? How do you do those things? That all falls in the area of persuasive computing, and we'll look at that in detail. But thinking now more broadly, let's think about social agents. So we've been talking about interfaces and basically mediums that we communicate through to other people. But what about communicating with a interface itself or with a device itself? So something like Amazon Alexa, something like even just a virtual avatar that can talk to you. This is Jibo, which is the latest failed home robot, which is basically, it's like an Alexa, but it's moves around a little bit. This is Vector, which is also an Alexa. Everything is pretty much an Alexa now. But it's a little robot that does expressive things, and it can play with this cube and do kind of interesting stuff. And this is a Now robot. This is one of the robots we use in a lot of our research, which is a humanoid robot. And I'll bring a few of him to class next week, so we can see that. But the question is, what changes here? So there's a lot of work that's been done, and the idea is that people do treat, in some cases, computers just as social beings themselves. But definitely once you put a face on something and you have it moving around and it seems to have a little bit of an intention or a belief or a desire in the world, and it's a little bit responsive, we treat these things in the same way we treat humans for the most part, in terms of our social expectations, the social cues we expect when we interact with them, and kind of what we expect them to do. People will typically, they see this robot, they will refer to it as he or she. We even saw this when people started first getting Roomba vacuum cleaners in their home, just the little vacuums to clean things automatically. A lot of people, there were studies done on this, they named them. Oddly enough, a lot of people named their vacuums. They ascribe a lot of personality and intention to them. They're all programmed to do the same thing. So we see people interact with things that way kind of by default. And even for me, like I've spent 10 years now with social robots and building them and programming them and hating them at 2 a.m. And knowing that they're not much more than the code and the hardware that I've put together. But it's hard not to refer to it kind of as a social thing in a lot of cases. And I think for me at least, I don't have a lot of expectations and a lot of the same beliefs that some people would have. But just at a surface level, the automatic way of thinking is to treat them as social agents. So I'm going to play you what may be a terrifying video now.
바빠서 저희 애기 첫 얼마 떼는 것도 못 봤어요.
Oh, I hope Buddy backs up to the cloud or something. Just in case. Okay, so here we see an idea that we're going to use a social agent to be a companion for our child, to help us care for our child, to interact with the child. Is this a good idea? Maybe in some aspects. Is it a bad idea? Probably in some aspects as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about that specifically, using these agents with children in a couple of slides. But I want to show you another application of kind of technology interfaces. This is the case of, and there's a lot of technology focused around helping people improve their skills at something, or helping people have access to things if they have an impairment. And this is one for improving social interactions. Ooh, that's beautiful.
When people talk to each other, the majority of the information that's conveyed comes from the way we say things, rather than the words we're actually saying. Eye contact, smiles, voice modulation, speaking rate, pauses, and emphasis on certain words often add an extra layer of information in our interactions. Many of us want to improve these interaction skills, but don't have the resources to do so. Imagine if you could practice your interaction skills with an automated system in the privacy of your own living room. A program designed at the MIT Media Lab lets you do just that.
I'm looking forward to doing your interview.
My automated conversation coach consists of a 3D character on a computer screen that can see, hear, and make its own decisions based on its interaction with a person, and it works on a personal computer.
Now, let's get started.
Using a webcam, the system can analyze facial expressions. For example, it can measure where in the interaction you are smiling and can recognize your head gestures such as a nod or a shake. The system also analyzes your voice. It not only understands what you say, but how you say it. Using real-time speech recognition and prosody analysis, it can capture the nonverbal nuances of conversations and display it in an intuitive format. When you're done, it gives you a summary of the information. When you smiled, how fast you spoke, and so on. And it can show how these measures change over multiple sessions. It even allows you to watch the video of your interactions with various measures of your behavior displayed alongside the video, such as when you smile, how the volume of your voice rises and falls, and what words you emphasize. It even shows when your attention wanders. In a study with 90 MIT undergraduates, the subjects went through simulated job interviews before and after receiving this training. Those who got the feedback from this automated system were rated as better candidates for the job than those who did not. Besides job interviews, the researchers say the system could help with public speaking, dating, learning languages, or helping people who have difficulties in social communications.
Some questions about video compression, but setting that aside. So the idea here is that we're kind of measuring everything that's going on, and we're also doing a little bit of prompting someone so that we can measure more things to mimic, in this case, a job interview. But the idea here is that it's going to help the person improve their skills, particularly in this case at interviewing. And you can see, like, the analysis that they were doing is considering a lot of those factors that we looked at in the beginning with those two people. So the things like their speech and the pauses and how that's going, their facial expressions, their movements, all of that is considered. So that kind of helps us transition into the idea of looking at physical and psychological well-being. I won't spend too much time today on physical well-being. Apart from saying, you know, we have things, either very specific systems for like physical rehabilitation in medical settings, but also things just for everyday physical fitness. So a lot of us have fitness trackers of some sort. We're kind of getting that data and using that to improve our physical fitness. We also look at this in terms of psychological well-being. So on exam 2, on the take-home exam, one of the prototype example was a mood tracking app. Okay, so that's like a really simple kind of idea where someone could journal what their feelings were at a particular time. And there are certainly a lot of apps that are focused around this now. The idea being that it's pretty important to record this stuff to get an idea of kind of how you're thinking and how things are going. And this is also a big part if you were to go into kind of a therapy process where you're trying to improve something in your life, you would start to journal this information as well. So this is one example of, this is a study that I was doing here at Mississippi State, and we were looking at doing a psychological intervention using either just a computer interface, an interactive interface, or the computer interface plus a robot that's guiding you through this. And so in this case, this research focuses on helping people set goals that they want to accomplish and establishing a plan for achieving that goal, and talking about things like getting around barriers to goals and that kind of idea. And so the thing that we were looking for in this is there a difference when someone interacts with just this tablet interface or a desktop interface versus when they interact with the same interface, the same content, the same idea, but they have kind of this robotic guide who's there with them, physically embodied, and seems to have a sense of what's going on. So you see a lot of research like this. Protection of vulnerable groups. So this is a huge one. So when we start to look especially at kids, so a lot of our research here with robots deals with children, and we do TheraBot stuff, so that deals with people who are in a therapy situation. But one of the big things that we see with children is what do children believe about the social agents, the technology that they're interacting with? What kind of protections do they think they have with those devices? And just in general, kind of the ethical questions that go along with that. So we've seen this with, there's a product, the first one that this was a big deal about was Hello Barbie was the name of the product. It was a Barbie that had a feature where you could talk to it. So it would speak back to you, it had a microphone, the kid could talk to it, ask it basic things. It turns out that Hello Barbie just like records everything that children say to it and puts it on a website that parents can access, and random people on the internet. But that's later. That's a separate issue. But thinking about this, children may not realize that the conversations that they have with Hello Barbie are being listened to by their parents later. That may not seem like a huge issue, but it could be if a kid says certain things to Hello Barbie. And so that's the kind of thing we start to be concerned with here. And I'll show you a video. This is a video of one of the participants in one of our studies answering some questions about the robot they had just spoken to. And you'll kind of get a sense of the beliefs they have about the robot. I don't think anybody's. So don't record this, but okay. So this covers a few things that I've been talking about. Number one, you'll notice that the interviewer in this study asked about the robot, and the child responded with the robot's name and talked about it just like it was any other social agent in their life. The child also ascribed feelings, emotions to the robot. And in this case, I should say right before this, we play a game with the kids after we're done with the main part of the study. And we started playing this 20 questions game. So we have them think of any character that they want to, and it's an online game. It's Akinator is the name of it, if you've ever heard of that. Anyways, we have an API to it. And so basically, the kids will think of a character. It could be from a movie or a book or whatever. And we'll ask them questions, and they answer yes, no. And then we have the robot guess their character. Unsurprisingly, we're pretty good at this because the game itself is pretty good at this. What's also nice about this game is that it's online and it's up to date. So like when they have a YouTuber that they're thinking of, we can get that as well. And so we've written some papers about this, but in particular, children really respect this robot afterwards and really feel that it has some superhuman abilities because it is reading their mind and seemingly, guessing this. And so that in itself, raises some ethical questions. So we do a lot of research looking at that. Moving beyond that, I want to touch on equality and fairness. So this example is not direct HCI, but it's something recent, and this is kind of a machine learning artificial intelligence example. Netflix. So if you use Netflix, the interface for Netflix on pretty much every device is thumbnails of the different shows or movies you can watch. And Netflix varies these thumbnails, and they write algorithms to try to basically figure out which thumbnails are going to get you to click. That's what Netflix wants you to do. They want you to click on things. But it turns out that Netflix, the AI or the machine learning that they were using in this case, started to recommend or create thumbnails specifically that varied, correlated heavily with the race of the user. And so this is concerning for a number of reasons. One of the broader reasons this is concerning is kind of this idea of, it's probably first called a filter bubble, I guess. And that's that when we have systems that learn about the user, they tend to optimize and really build a world that's just for that user. And so you may never see something new because the profile a system is built about you only wants to give you things that it thinks you're going to like. And so, one idea that I think we talked about in the HCI class that I took as an undergraduate was that maybe Google should always give you a result for like the opposite of what you Googled. Like something is just like completely orthogonal to what you wanted, just to kind of encourage people to explore. But so this is a broader issue, and obviously the more specific issue, and an issue that we see in other machine learning algorithms and systems, is that they will adopt the biases that we have as humans, as a society, that those will be encoded into a system. And so in a sense, we can create systems that follow our stereotypes and further them. And that's something we don't want to do in a lot of cases. And in a lot of cases, we've spent a lot of time as a society trying to tear down some of the more harmful stereotypes that we've developed. And so we have to be careful when we design systems that we don't encode that. And what would it be if I couldn't have another picture of Mark Zuckerberg looking hopeless and human? But Facebook changing its news feed again to stop fake news. And this has become something that's become huge for us in the US at least, and everywhere else probably as well at this point. But the idea that the systems we develop and the different interfaces we're providing people need to curate the content. They need to make a decision, in this case about what is real factual reporting and what is not. And we'll talk about it a little bit more when we talk about AI and machine learning on Tuesday, but this is hard to do. It's hard for humans to do, and it's hard for AI to do. It's hard for machine learning to do in a lot of cases. There are some trivial cases that are easy to see, but a lot of it is not that clear cut. But these are things we have to think about. So there are, it's kind of just a broader question: where else does HCI end up running into social concerns? And it's everywhere now. We integrate more and more technology into more and more areas of life, and that just continues to bring up these issues. And so if you start to look at recent literature, any kind of research that's going on, anything that larger companies are being careful about or studying, a lot of it will have to do with these social concerns and how the technology interacts with that kind of thing. Okay, before we wrap up, I want to show you a video, and this is a trailer for the CHI conference this year, which is in, I think, like May 4th or 5th. but it's just like kind of little snapshots of what's going to be there. So this is kind of the latest HCI research. So lots of interesting stuff. That's just a few highlights, but it's definitely worth checking out some of the Kai proceedings and some of the videos too. So next time we'll talk about robots, AI, machine learning, AR, VR, and we'll have a short quiz on social HCI.
So you watch